There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised.
It's a clear, still Tuesday morning in New York City. The autumn sky is bright blue and the two World Trade Centers mark the highest points of the Manhattan skyline. At 8:30 a.m, the business district is bustling. Workers are making their way into elevators or stopping for a quick coffee. Their minds are on their morning meeting or the kids they just dropped off at school. Most don't notice the plane flying too low, far too low, until they hear it. A terrible sound pierces through one of the biggest cities in the world as a passenger plane flies directly into the North Tower. Within minutes, the story will go live across the globe.
We're joined by the entire network just to show you some pictures at the foot of New York City. This is at the World Trade Center. Obviously a major fire there, and there has been some sort of explosion. We don't fully know the details. There is one report, as of yet unconfirmed, that a plane has hit the World Trade Center, and you can see that there is smoke there coming out of at least two sides of the building.
What they don't know yet is that in 17 minutes, a second plane will collide with the South Tower. This isn't an accident, it's an attack. On September 11, 2001, 2,976 people were killed as a result of 4 hijacked commercial airliners. 2 crashed into the World Trade Centers, a third targeted the Pentagon, with a fourth aiming for the US Capitol building, but it was brought down in a field by several brave passengers. 5 men have been charged with these acts of terrorism, and the case is the largest criminal prosecution in US history in terms of the number of victims. But this episode is not about the men responsible. It's about how that day truly unfolded and the nearly 3,000 victims who did not know those early hours of September 11 would be their last. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is the first of a 2-part series, re-examining the events that unfolded on September 11, 2001. Our guest, Garrett Graff, is an award-winning journalist and author who today serves as director of the Aspen Institute's Cybersecurity and Technology program. He's written for numerous highly regarded publications, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times, and he's served as the editor of 2 of Washington's most prestigious magazines. His book, The Only Plane in the Sky, is the first comprehensive oral history of September 11, that weaves through the voices of Americans on the front lines of an unprecedented national trauma. For people who were inside the North Tower just after 8:45 a.m. on September 11, what did you learn about their experience when the plane first hit? What did they think had happened?
So the World Trade Center, the 2 twin towers, were the largest office buildings in the world. And this was 2001. So this was before email was as ubiquitous as it is today, before cell phones were as ubiquitous as it is today. So the news of what precisely happened that morning at 8:46 in the North Tower trickled out relatively slowly. Very few people understood that a large plane had hit the building. And in fact, for some period of time, even stayed at their desks. And this was one of the things that's sort of interesting about how that 102 minutes unfold between the first crash and the collapse of the tower. it trickles out in the stairwells as people are going down the building. They are walking down the stairwell, and that sort of word is being passed person to person in the stairwell that a plane had hit the building. But again, many people thought it was a small plane, and many people assumed it had been an accident, because accidents like that actually did happen. Famously, a plane had actually hit the upper stories of the Empire State Building in the years after World War II. And that there was also very little sense among the people in the North Tower that there was any risk to the building collapsing. So one of the things that's so interesting about watching the word spread of what was happening to that building is that people didn't necessarily rush out of the building even when they realized it had been struck by a plane, because there wasn't necessarily much of a fear that the building might actually collapse. So they didn't realize that they were racing a ticking clock.
What's fascinating is that it was almost as though people on the other side of the world had more of a sense of what was happening than people inside the building, because we had seen what had happened, or we had a sense that a plane had flown through. And so what you found were, in terms of phone calls, people inside were actually trying to understand what happened. Is that right?
Exactly. And this is part of what is so amazing about going back and trying to reconstruct that day, is realizing how little information the people at the center of the events had. So in many cases, you actually see people in the building calling out on the phone or emailing, colleagues or family members or friends to say, like, can you turn on the TV and tell me what's happened to the building? And so in many ways, this is true at the Twin Towers, at the Pentagon, in Pennsylvania, even with the President of the United States aboard Air Force One. The average person sitting at home watching 9/11 unfold on television had a better understanding of what was taking place that day than some of the key actors. And, when you talk about being on the other side of the world and knowing what was going on, a part of what makes 9/11 so unique, and we don't know how much of this was intentional by the terrorists, but the specific timing that they hit, in that 9 a.m. hour in New York City on the East Coast of the United States, meant that they managed to capture almost the entire rest of the world, attention-wise. You're talking early afternoon in Europe and Africa, and, late evening really across most of Asia. And so much of the world was able to tune in live that day to the events of 9/11 just because of the sort of precise timing that it happened.
Now to some breaking news just through, and CNN is reporting tonight that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. Eyewitness reports believe it was a kamikaze act from the pilot where he deliberately aligned himself. Goodness me, I'm sorry. You can see there the second tower, it does appear, may well have been collapsing.
For those who were in the South Tower, what were they told to do at this point? Were they told to evacuate or stay put? Did they have much of a sense of what had happened?
So they, in some ways, had a better sense than some of the people in the North Tower, because they could look across the plaza of the World Trade Center and see the burning wreckage of the impact into the North Tower, at least on certain sides of the South Tower. But the World Trade Center facility, the complex, was the responsibility of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And in those first moments after the first crash, the Port Authority actually made building-wide announcements across the South Tower that people should stay at their desks, that this was an incident that was confined to the North Tower, and that the South Tower could go about their normal day. And that's in fact what you see many people in the South Tower do, is that they stay at their desks, they watch the flames and the smoke. And in fact, some of the people who had started to evacuate in the South Tower after that first crash, out of an abundance of caution, ended up returning to their desks. Most tragically and most famously, Many of the employees of Fuji Bank actually set out to evacuate from the South Tower, started to evacuate, and then ended up returning to their desks at the instructions of the Port Authority. And so were sitting in their offices at 9:03 when the second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, crashed into the South Tower. And for the first moment, caused people to realize that this was an attack and not just an accident.
Can you describe the scenes below? So for passers-by or people who worked nearby, who were watching these towers actually fall, what were they seeing? What was their experience that morning?
So this says a lot about the psychology of America in 2001. Much of the United States did not default in those initial minutes to thinking that this was terrorism. And when I talk about 9/11, I always talk about those 17 minutes between 8:46 and 9:03 as, to me, the most fascinating moments of 9/11, because you see in those 17 minutes a country that is far more innocent and far more naive about the world than anything that we would imagine today. And so in those 17 minutes, people see that first crash, and across the country, from the streets of New York to Washington, D.C., to the president and his traveling party in Sarasota, Florida that day, sort of people collectively shrug. I quote in my book the story of Peter Johansson, who was a New York waterways passenger commuter ferry captain, and how he talks about from his ferry, they watched that first crash at 8:46, and then he proceeded into Wall Street Terminal, which is right at the base of Lower Manhattan, right where the World Trade Center is, and dock, and every single person gets off and walks into Lower Manhattan. Every commuter that day walked off that ferry amid the debris and the paper literally raining down on them from the North Tower. But there wasn't a single person aboard the ferry who looked at that and said, you know what, this just kind of seems like it's going to be a weird day. I'm going to go work from home for the rest of the day. And instead, what you see is over the course of those 17 minutes, that same reaction play out across the country. I quote in the book Brian Gunderson, who is the chief of staff to the House Majority Leader at the U.S. Capitol. And he walks into his 9 a.m. staff meeting that morning, sees the crash on the television, and has the same thought process that so many other people did. You know, it's probably a small plane. It's probably an accident. Maybe air traffic control is having a bad day. Maybe the pilot had a heart attack. Maybe the plane had a mechanical problem. And he goes on into his 9 a.m. staff meeting and he says, I thought it was going to be like a bad school shooting, the type of thing that dominates national news but doesn't actually change anyone's day. And the same conversation actually takes place with the president and his national security advisor. Condoleezza Rice calls down from the White House to President George W. Bush in Florida, and they have that exact same conversation. Well, that's weird. I wonder what could have happened there. And then Condoleezza Rice walks into her 9 a.m. staff meeting, and President Bush walks into the classroom of elementary school kids that he was supposed to be reading to that morning. And sort of everyone goes about their day normally on the streets of New York, on the streets of Washington, with the president until that second crash at 9:03. And President Bush, as he has said later, the first crash was an accident. The second crash was an attack. The third crash was a declaration of war.
The people who knew early on that this wasn't just an accident were, of course, the people who were in the hijacked planes. From your research, what do you actually know about what took place inside those planes before they flew into the trade centers?
So there are sort of two different experiences on the planes. There are the first three planes, American Airlines Flight 11, which crashes into the North Tower at 8:46, United Airlines Flight 175, which crashes into the South Tower at 9:03, and then the third plane, American Airlines Flight 77, that crashes into the Pentagon at 9:37. And those first two planes have a very, in some ways, normal experience of a hijacking. And by normal, what I mean is until 9/11, America had never experienced a hijacking where the hijackers themselves took control of the plane. Hijackings are, in global aviation, not common events, but they're also not rare events. In the 1970s, in the peak of hijackings in the United States, there was a hijacking about once a week. And they were criminal matters. They were bank robbers trying to hijack a plane to flee to Cuba. In the 1980s and 1990s, you saw hijackings with political purposes. You saw Palestinian terror groups, trying to hijack planes, land them safely, and hold hostages in exchange for some type of political ransom. The protocols in aviation up until 9/11 all told pilots and flight crews and passengers to cooperate with terrorists. Do what the terrorists want, fly where the terrorists want, and get the plane on the ground and assume that sort of almost everyone, if not everyone, is going to get out of it safely. Injuries were rare, deaths were rare. And while it was something that people talked about in pop culture from time to time in movies or thrillers, in real life, no pilot had ever used a plane as a missile. And so the passengers aboard really the first three planes that day all, to some extent, cooperated with the terrorists and assumed that the terrorists were conducting a, quote unquote, normal hijacking. It was only in the final minutes of American Airlines Flight 77 that some of the passengers were able to use their cell phones and reach people on the ground who told them that their planes were actually likely being turned into a guided missile. What is different that morning is the fourth plane, United Airlines Flight 93, which was supposed to take off at the same time as the other three hijacked flights, but took off about 42 minutes late. And those 42 minutes end up making all of the difference, because what it means when the passengers aboard United Airlines Flight 93, the passengers and crew, begin to call down using cell phones and airphones to reach colleagues, coworkers, family, and friends on the ground, they begin to hear about the other crashes, those crashes at the World Trade Center, the crash at the Pentagon. And so what you see is that the passengers of United Airlines Flight 93 realize that they are doomed in a way that the passengers of the first three hijacked flights that morning never really had the opportunity to realize. And with that knowledge, the passengers and crew make a very quick decision to fight back. They storm the cockpit around 9:59 that morning, and they end up wresting control of the cockpit from the hijackers. And in the hijackers' final minutes at 10:03 that morning, they crash the plane into an abandoned coal mine in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
You write about some of the calls that were made inside those planes. What were people saying when they realised that things weren't right and they had started to panic? What were they saying to loved ones who were at home?
The calls are incredibly haunting, and it's a combination of people saying goodbye to their families, to their friends, coworkers.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m.
Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully.
I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
It's also, particularly on United Airlines Flight 93, the people who are called hear the passengers and crew sort of formulating the plan to fight back. And it comes together very, very quickly between basically 9:35 and 9:50, really. And then they end up, storming the cockpit, and the passengers and crew can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder that was recovered later in the crash, and the hijackers discussing what they should do, whether they should purposely crash the plane. And then at the sort of final words on the cockpit voice recorder is a voice in Arabic, presumably one of the hijackers, repeating Allahu Akbar, God is great, as a voice in English screams no.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with historian and best-selling author Garrett Graff about the September 11 terror attacks. Back in the Twin Towers, people who were on particularly those upper floors, were calling 911 operators, emergency services, because they were in such a state of panic. What did they ask and what did operators say? Because I can't imagine what a hopeless situation that must have been. They must have just felt like there wasn't much they could do, but it could have been one of the last phone calls they ever made.
Part of what makes that day unique, again, is, you just see one collective failure of imagination after another. And what I mean by that is even the 911 emergency operators, they don't necessarily understand that the building could collapse. Until September 11th, 2001, no high-rise building in the world had ever collapsed due to fire. So what that means is it's not really in the mental model of the firefighters and first responders who are racing to the scene, the firefighters and police officers and EMTs who are climbing the stairs to try to go fight the fire. It's not in the models, in the minds of the emergency dispatchers and operators, and it's not really in the minds of the office workers. They don't necessarily realize that the people that they are talking to are doomed, that the people who are above the crash site in the North Tower and the South Tower, that they have no way to escape. And some of that has to do with going back to 1993, which was when the first World Trade Center bombing happened. And there were a couple of things that were sort of different there. One, the buildings stood. And so it took a long time to evacuate everyone, but eventually people were evacuated. And two is in 1993, the police helicopters actually were able to evacuate victims off the roofs of the tower. And so even for the people who were trapped above the crash site, there was some hope initially in 2001, that worst comes to worst, they can get a helicopter onto the roof and evacuate us then. What the people in the building didn't understand at the time is that, A, the Port Authority had changed its policy to discourage roof rescues. And so the doors to the roof were locked and there would have been no way to get out there in the first place. And two, that in the very first moments after that first attack, the NYPD helicopters flying over the city, the pilots realized that there was too much smoke and it was too hot over the buildings, and that it was not going to be possible to effect a roof rescue under any circumstances. And so for much of that time, the people trapped above the crash sites didn't necessarily realize that they were doomed.
There's the story of Will Gemino, who I believe was trapped underneath the towers. What happened to him? You tell that one in the book.
One of the aspects of that day that is so stark is that in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, there was a wide expectation that there would be thousands of injuries and thousands of injured victims. The New York hospitals cleared the decks and instituted all sorts of emergency protocols to triage victims, to set up satellite emergency departments. And I was a college student in Boston at the time, and I remember distinctly the hospitals in Boston being readied to receive what everyone assumed was going to be this flood of injuries coming out of the collapse of the World Trade Center. But the collapse of the buildings was so complete, so quick, and so violent that there were effectively no survivors, and that those injuries just never materialized. Those injured never appeared at the hospitals. And in fact, there were just 16 people rescued from the landscape of the Twin Towers. And almost all of those were a group of people who survived in what was known as Stairwell B in the North Tower, which was a part of one of the three stairways in the building that survived actually atop the wreckage. So there was just sort of a quirk in the way that the North Tower fell, that it shielded this one corner of this one stairwell. And there was this group of New York City firefighters and Port Authority police officers and some civilian who were trapped in that one particular section of the stairwell that actually ended up effectively on the top of the wreckage. There were just 2 people total who survived from underneath the collapse of the towers. And it was 2 Port Authority police officers, Will Gemino and his Sergeant John McLaughlin. They'd been part of a team of 5 Port Authority police officers who had been on their way into the rescue zone and were trapped by the collapse of the South Tower, effectively underneath the space between the South Tower and the North Tower. And 2 of the 5 died in that first collapse of the South Tower at 9:59. A third officer was killed by the collapse of the North Tower in the wreckage, Dominic Pizzullo. And then these 2 police officers, Will Gemino and John McLaughlin, actually managed to survive. And they were found that evening around 8 p.m. in the wreckage. They were actually found by some sort of all weird coincidences, 2 U.S. Marines who had self-responded to the scene and were walking across the wreckage field, this charred hellscape of the footprint of the towers, the 16-acre hellscape, who happened to hear the shouts of help from the wreckage below from Will and began to flag down some NYPD rescue crews who began to dig them out. And it took about 3 hours to dig out Will Gemino. He was rescued around 11 p.m. and Sergeant John McLaughlin pulled from the rubble about 8 hours later at 7 a.m. on Wednesday, September 12th. And he was the second to last person found alive in the wreckage of the World Trade Center. And so as those crews sort of spread out over the course of Tuesday and Wednesday, thinking that they might find, dozens, scores, hundreds of survivors buried in the wreckage, there was only one person left to find after John McLaughlin was pulled from the wreckage.
Incredible. Finally, I wanted to ask, there are so many stories that you share of civilians and people who came to help and politicians. What are some of the stories that have stayed with you the most since writing the book?
To me, the most haunting stories of that day are the stories of the way that luck determines who lives and dies. You know, depending on sort of how religious you are, you know, this is luck, this is fate, this is faith, this is chance. But so much of that day ends up being determined by these incredibly small decisions that each of us makes on a daily basis, 1,000 times a day, without ever thinking about the alternate universes that we are unlocking. You know, when you place a telephone call, when you run an errand, which bus you catch, which plane you book, when you step outside to have a cigarette, when you run an errand. Michael LaMonaco, the chef at Windows on the World, the restaurant atop the North Tower, he lived because he stopped that morning of all mornings to get a new pair of glasses at LensCrafters on his way into work. On any other day, he would have been in his office in the kitchen atop the North Tower by 8:30. And that morning, he stops to get a new pair of glasses and misses the last elevator to the top, and 70 of his colleagues die, and he lives. Monica O'Leary, who's someone that I talk about in the book, on Monday, September 10th, she is the unluckiest person at Cantor Fitzgerald, the financial services firm that also has offices atop the North Tower. And she's laid off. She's fired on the afternoon of Monday, September 10th. And then she gathers her belongings in a box and walks around the floor and says goodbye to her colleagues. And then the next morning on the roof of her apartment building, she watches as the North Tower collapses and 658 of her colleagues at Cantor Fitzgerald die, and she lives. And she actually rejoined the firm the following week to help them rebuild. And she had never been taken off payroll because all of the HR personnel people died that Tuesday in the collapse. And so the paperwork was never processed, firing her. Then in the Pentagon, there's this story of this one conference room that's hit, and you know, the room explodes in smoke and fire as the plane impacts the building around them. And as they come out of the conference room evacuating, you know, it's dark, it's smoky, everything around them is on fire, and everyone who turns left coming out of the conference room dies, and everyone who turns right lives. Seth MacFarlane, the comedian, the creator of the television show Family Guy, he was booked that morning on American Airlines Flight 11. And this was 2001. This was like 1,000, million years ago in terms of technology. And this was when you had a travel agent book your plane tickets and then type you out an itinerary. You know, there were no mobile boarding passes. There were no phone alerts as to when your plane was supposed to depart. And his travel agent, just that morning of all mornings, happened to have mistyped the departure time of American Airlines Flight 11 by 10 minutes. And he gets to the airport in Boston to fly back to Los Angeles, and he's missed the flight by 10 minutes. And he thinks nothing of it and rebooks himself on the next flight and, goes to sleep in the airport lounge and, wakes up about 90 minutes later as everyone around him starts to scream. And, but for that totally random typo, Seth MacFarlane would have been killed on 9/11. And you see this just play out person after person, place after place through that whole day. And to me, it's sort of those stories that just weigh so heavily in my mind, because it's that sort of sense of luck, that faith, that chance that we just never think about as we go about our normal days and make these little tiny choices without sort of thinking about what they actually could mean for the rest of our lives, for our friends, for our family, and, as I said, sort of the alternate universes that we are creating by stopping to get coffee now instead of later.
It's a sheer randomness, and you write as well about for every choice that was made that meant that someone missed a flight or wasn't in the building, another random choice was made, whether it was a visitor to the tower or someone who shouldn't have been there that day and just was. And so there's no sense to it, or there's no fairness. It's just completely random. And when you look at the death toll, I mean, it's just something that you can't comprehend is what was lost that day. And what you do so incredibly is put individual faces and names to the people affected, which we can often, I think, forget when you see how large the number is, and it just becomes a historical event.
Yeah, and I think that's, to me, part of why I wanted to tell this story in an oral history format through the voices of the people who lived the day is that, we're at this like very weird moment where, we're 20 years after the attack and we are beginning to see a generation come of age who have lived their entire lives in the world created by 9/11, but who have no memory of the day itself. A little more than a third of the world's population was born after 9/11 now.
Wow.
And the story that we tell them, the story that we sort of tell in history books about 9/11, is this really neat and clean and tidy story. It's this idea of, the attacks began at 8:46 in the morning. There were 4 planes. There was the Twin Towers. There was the Pentagon. There was Shanksville. And that the whole thing was over 102 minutes later with the collapse of that second tower. But for anyone who was alive that day, whether you were on the streets of New York, whether you were watching on TV in the United States, or whether you were in Australia, that's not the day that any of us alive actually remember living. Because, as we've discussed, people didn't realize that these were attacks when they began. They didn't realize for many hours how many attacks there actually were. And this fear existed around the world that something else might happen on September 12th, on the afternoon of September 11th. There might be a second wave of attacks in October. And that when you talk to people sort of all around the world about their experiences and memories of 9/11, no one had a expectation on the day of September 11th or the day of September 12th that this was something that was only going to be contained to New York, to Washington, and to this random field in Pennsylvania. And so the oral history format, the oral history tradition, I think is a really important one because it puts people back in the moments of 9/11 as that day unfolds, knowing only what they knew at the time. And to me, the story of 9/11 is not just the story of the facts of the day, as sort of horrific and awful as they are, but it is the story as well of the fear, the chaos, the confusion, and the trauma that was felt across the United States and even around the world. And that when you look at how Western governments responded to 9/11, including the government in Australia, we responded out of that fear of what came next. The fear, the chaos, the confusion, and trauma of that day drove the military response, the law enforcement response, the intelligence response, the political response in a way that is sort of crazy to go back and look at objectively and abstractly today, but makes a lot more sense when you go back and you understand just the fear and the chaos and the confusion that transpired in the course of that day as it was actually lived by the people who were living it.
That's what I suppose history misses sometimes, is how the day felt. And even in Sydney, I was 10, and the panic in the classroom, there were kids hiding under desks in my classroom in Sydney. And I remember we were going on a family holiday and we decided to drive and not fly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it impacted us. And then to think how it must have felt in New York, and that's a generation-defining event. I mean, it's a, century-defining event because, as you say, it was when I think much of the Western world lost its innocence.
Exactly.
And then everything, a sound on an aeroplane or even security at airports. I mean, everything from then on was seen through the lens of potential terrorism. And that doesn't leave a generation, I think.
Exactly, very much so. And that becomes sort of part of, the whole response that we see as well, which is, one of the reasons that we have never seen terrorists attempt a hijacking effort like this before is no passengers and crew would ever let it happen again in the way that the passengers and crew of Flight 93 had that extra 42 minutes and made a different set of decisions and, were able to bring that plane down. And that's, I think, what terrorists imagine now would happen to anyone who attempted to hijack a plane since.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for helping to keep the memory of that day alive.
Garrett Graff is a distinguished magazine journalist and best-selling historian who's spent more than 12 years covering politics, technology, and national security. His latest book, Only Plane in the Sky, is a New York Times bestseller that draws on never-before-published transcripts, recently declassified documents, and original interviews and stories from nearly 500 people to paint a comprehensive minute-by-minute account of the September 11 attacks. You can find a link to it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and is produced by Gia Moylan. I'll be back next week continuing our two-part series on the September 11 attacks by speaking with a woman who was working in a New York City hospital on that day. In the meantime, if you want to hear more from me, you can find me on Mamamia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as Cancelled, a comedy podcast about the stories of celebrity cancellations.